These are the recorded lectures for Chapter 32 on the cardiovascular system, and we are on slide number 19, the heartbeat. So during one heartbeat, you have contraction and relaxation, and the word for contraction is systole. The word for relaxation is diastole. The cardiac cycle is a two-part pumping action that takes about a second. And the cardiac cycle lasts as long as a heartbeat lasts. What you can see here is the aortic valve closed in probably a sheep heart or maybe a human heart. But you can see that it's closed, and you see how those little valves that form, there are three valves that form the aortic valve, and it's the same way for the pulmonary valve, but they look like half moons a little bit. So a pulse, whenever you take somebody's pulse, is a wave effect passing down the walls of the arterial blood vessels when the aorta expands and recoils following ventricular systole, or the contraction of the ventricles, when the ventricles contract and pump blood through the aorta. And as far as the conduction system of the heart that keeps the heart pumping, it's an intrinsic conduction system, and it begins with the SA node, which stands for sinoatrial node. And the SA node is in the right atrium, and it's the pacemaker of the heart, and that is where the electrical signals begin that cause the heart to beat, and that cause the heart to contract and relax. And then the AV node is also in the right atrium, but it's a little bit further down from the SA node. And that will send, the signals come from the SA node to the AV node, and then they will signal the ventricles to contract. But the pacemaker of the heart is the SA node. Now, you've probably heard of an ECG or EKG. You may have even had one done on you before. It's an electrocardiogram, which is a recording of the electrical changes that occur in the myocardium, or the heart muscle, during the cardiac cycle. The first little wave is a little peak, is called the P wave, and when you see that wave on the ECG, as soon as that wave comes up, then the atria are about to contract. So it triggers atrial contraction. And then the QRS complex, which is the large peak that you see on an ECG, that signals that the ventricles are about to contract. And the T wave, which comes after that QRS complex, signals that the ventricles are relaxing. So once you see the P wave, you know that the atria are about to contract and pump the last of most of the blood in the atrium just enters the ventricles by the force of gravity, but the atria do pump blood into the ventricles too. So it's both of those actions that cause blood to leave the atria and enter the ventricles. So those atria are going to contract as soon as you see that P wave. The P wave shows the electrical signal from the SA node, and then you're going to see the mechanical event, which is the contraction of the atria. Then the QRS, once that peak comes up, you're going to see the ventricles contract. And then once you see the T wave come up, you're going to see that the ventricles relax. So to the right, picture B, you can see what an ECG looks like whenever ventricles are in fibrillation. All right, as far as the circuits, we have two circuits. There's the pulmonary circuit, which is basically the circuit between the heart and the lungs, takes oxygen-poor blood to the lungs and returns oxygen-rich blood to the heart. And then the systemic circuit takes that oxygen-rich blood from the heart to all of the cells of the body, including the heart itself, and then drops off the oxygen to the cells, and then returns the oxygen-poor blood to the heart through the vena cava. As far as blood pressure, we use those terms systole and diastole again for the same reason. The systolic pressure is the higher pressure in a blood pressure reading, is the top number, and the diastolic is the bottom number or the lower pressure. Blood pressure is measured with a sphygmomanometer or blood pressure cuff. We wrap it around the upper arm, and the artery that we're closing off briefly is the brachial artery. And then as far as the units that we use, when we measure blood pressure, it's millimeters of mercury, which are units of pressure. So basically how it works is this. You have this cuff, and you tighten it around the brachial artery and close off the brachial artery. Then when you slowly release the pressure, when you are taking someone's blood pressure, you will hear the very first heartbeat. And that will be, when you hear that heartbeat, you will see a number on the dial. Wherever the needle is on the dial that you're looking at, that will show you the systolic pressure. That's the highest pressure. And then you will keep listening and keep looking at the needle on the dial until you hear the last heartbeat. And the very, very last heartbeat that you hear, wherever the needle is at that point, will be your diastolic pressure. So that is how it works. I also have learned to watch the needle. It will start to kind of flick. It has a special way that it will flick whenever the systolic pressure begins, whenever you hear the first heartbeat coming through that brachial artery. So I'll watch that needle. When it flicks the first time, that will be the systolic. And then the last time it flicks, it will be the diastolic. But it's just one of those things, you have to do it to understand. And some of you may have. There is a problem with getting blood back to the heart from the veins, because by the time blood reaches the veins, blood pressure is so low that just blood pressure itself is not going to be enough to get the blood back to the heart. So the primary event or action that's going to get blood back to the heart is skeletal muscle contraction. As you move, as you walk, as you move your muscles and use your body, your skeletal muscles contract, and they push against the veins. And that is why exercise is good for your circulatory system. You probably heard that before, maybe from your mom or your grandmother. But that is the reason why, is because it helps to get blood back to the heart from the veins. Now, there are a couple of other things that help that process, and one is that veins have valves. So once blood has passed through a valve, it's not going to go backward. And then there's a note here about varicose veins. Varicose veins develop especially in the legs when valves become ineffective. And a lot of times this is when someone is very heavy. They can be overweight. They can be pregnant. They can just sit or stand a lot, and not move much. And some people just have them genetically. They just genetically are predisposed to having varicose veins. The respiratory pump is just referring to the pumping action that comes from breathing. So as you breathe, blood is going to be it's going to cause the blood to kind of move from your lower body up to your heart. Okay. This is a diagram that shows you blood pressure in relation to the different blood vessels. So notice in the arteries, the blood pressure is highest. Then it goes down in the arterioles, kind of in the middle here for capillaries, but it gets very, very low in the venules and then the veins. And this is a picture that's showing you the pumping action of skeletal muscle on veins. And it also shows you the valves of the veins. So once that valve closes, any blood that has moved past the valve is not going to go backwards. Then you need to know a little bit about cardiovascular disease. It is the leading cause of death in most Western countries. Of course, that counts the United States. Hypertension is just the medical term for high blood pressure. 30% of Americans suffer from hypertension or high blood pressure, and it's caused by the narrowing of the arteries due to atherosclerosis. Atherosclerosis is the accumulation of fat and plaque in the inner linings of the arteries. A clot can also form, and a clot is called a thrombus, and that can also form and cause the opening in the arteries to be smaller. Now, a stroke is when a blood vessel that supplies the brain is blocked, and the blockage is called an embolus. A heart attack is called a myocardial infarction, and that is when a coronary artery that supplies the heart becomes blocked. So a blockage to the brain is a stroke, and a blockage to the coronary arteries is a heart attack or myocardial infarction, which literally means myo means muscle, cardial means heart, infarction means death. So it literally means heart muscle death. Okay. Now, the pain in the chest, the squeezing sensation that comes due to a blockage, it often happens during a heart attack, is called angina pectoris. It just means chest pain. And this is showing you an artery that's blocked, and notice that, it's only partially allowing blood through. Some of the treatment for blocked arteries, they will do a catheterization to see if the artery is blocked, and then they will place a stent into that blocked artery, sometimes to keep it open. Sometimes they will do something called balloon angioplasty, where they inflate a balloon, and then they use the stent. They inflate the balloon to open up the artery, and then they use a stent to keep it open. And then, of course, another type of surgery is just open heart surgery. They can do a bypass. So if the stent and the balloon angioplasty are ineffective, then they will decide to do a bypass. And that is when they take a vein or a blood vessel from usually your leg region, and they will insert it and bypass that blockage and just make another pathway. Basically is what that is. All right, for blood, make sure that you know the composition of blood. First of all, blood is divided into the fluid portion, which is plasma, and the formed elements, which are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. The plasma is composed of 90% or more of water, and then plasma proteins, which help to keep the blood thicker than the tissue fluid or more dense. And it helps because the blood itself is high, a higher concentration of plasma proteins. It will draw water into the blood vessels. So water is constantly being drawn into the blood vessels. Because of these plasma proteins, that makes the blood plasma thicker than the tissue fluid, or more concentrated than the tissue fluid. Then you have some salts, you have gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, you have nutrients, which are lipids or fats, glucose, which comes from our carbohydrates, and amino acids, which comes from our proteins. These are nutrients that travel through the blood. Then the blood will also contain waste, such as urea and uric acid, and hormones. Hormones are released into the bloodstream, and then the blood vessels will take the hormones to their target, whichever their target organ is. Now, red blood cells are also called erythrocytes. The function of red blood cells is to transport oxygen and somewhat to transport carbon dioxide. They're shaped like you see in the picture. They almost look like a donut. They're concave on both sides, but the hole doesn't go all the way through. So it's just like a depression on both sides of the red blood cell. Then you have the white blood cells, or leukocytes, that fight infection, and you can see the different ones here. The phagocytes are the neutrophils, and the monocytes, which I'm sorry for that. I had a phone call. So the monocytes are actually the largest white blood cells, and they'll form into macrophages, which means big eater, but they will engulf and destroy by phagocytosis, any pathogens or bacteria or just anything harmful. And neutrophils are the first responders to an infection. They move through the bloodstream very fast to the site of infection and start to engulf and destroy the bacteria or pathogen that's causing the infection. Eosinophils are more for parasites and worms. And basophils release histamine. So they're the reason that they help to they help us out, but the histamine also makes us have, allergy symptoms and that kind of thing. So, which is why we take antihistamines. And then lymphocytes are the ones that are special, that are the B cells and the T cells that are specific to a specific infection. So there would be like a lymphocyte that attacks specifically, strep throat bacteria, streptococcus bacteria, which causes strep throat, just something like it'll be specific to what it attacks. Whereas the other ones are going to only attack something that is foreign. They're going to recognize that it's not supposed to be in our body and they'll attack it. The platelets, the other word for platelet is thrombocyte, and they function in blood clotting. They are just fragments of cells, and that is their role, is to function in blood clotting. Okay, and so this is slide 35. I'll start with this slide for the last part of the recording.